everybody. Are you ready to get started on our book again about Helen Keller? Well, let's go. There was so much she could not know. One day, Helen spilled some water on her apron. She took it off and laid it down in front of the fireplace, but it did not dry fast enough to please her. She moved it closer and closer. Finally, she laid the apron right on top of the flames. The flames shot up through the apron, then to Helen's dress. Fire! She was on fire! Helen screamed. Someone was in the next room. The fire was put out before it did any harm. But she could have been killed, Mrs. Keller said. Or she could have burned the whole house down, Helen's father answered, and us with it. How much longer could this go on? When Helen was 5 years old, her sister Mildred was born. All Helen knew about this baby was that it took up too much of her mother's time up until now that had belonged to her. Too often when Helen wanted to run into her mother's arms, she found that the baby was already there. One day, Helen reached out for her doll's cradle and found the baby inside. This was too much. Helen growled like an animal. Then she reached out and knocked the cradle over. The baby fell screaming to the floor. Mildred wasn't hurt, but what about next time? Helen was growing bigger and wilder every day. Next time she might really hurt the baby, or worse, Helen's father said. No, I'm afraid there is only one thing we can do. We will have to send Helen away. Send her away? Mrs. Keller cried. Where would we send her? But she knew the answer herself. There was only one place that would take a wild creature like Helen, the state insane asylum. Let's wait just a little bit longer, Mrs. Keller begged. Mr. Keller nodded, but they both knew that there was no real answer. They both knew that sooner or later, Helen would have to be sent away. Then one day, Mrs. Keller read about a special school in Boston, Massachusetts, called Perkins Institute. Perkins was a school for the blind. But once, long ago, the teachers there had taught a little girl who was both blind and deaf. Somehow they had worked out a way to make her understand the outside world. Write to them, Mrs. Keller begged her husband. Maybe they can help Helen too. Helen's father shook his head. He had almost run out of hope. But that night he sat down and wrote a letter to Perkins Institute. Now there was nothing else to do but wait. The stranger comes. That's our next chapter. What was going on? Helen had known all day that something was. The house had been cleaned from top to bottom. Even the guest room had been opened and aired. Wonderful smells kept coming from the kitchen, and everyone was busy, much too busy to bother with her. Late in the afternoon, Helen felt her mother put on her hat and her gloves. Helen had learned long ago that this meant her mother was going somewhere, so she held onto her mother's skirt. She wanted to go too, but Mrs. Keller pulled away gently and drove off in the carriage alone. Whatever was going on, Helen didn't like it. She was 6 years old, but she had no words to tell how she felt. Every once in a while, she shook her head sadly and she waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Then suddenly, Helen stood very still. She seemed to be listening as hard as she could. In a way, she was not with her ears, but with her whole body. Helen couldn't hear the loudest noise in the world, but sometimes she could feel things slam or shake around her. She could feel their vibrations coming through the air and the ground. Now she felt the thud of horses' hoofs, the vibration of carriage wheels coming back up the drive. The carriage stopped in front of the porch. Now Helen felt footsteps coming towards her across the porch floor. It must be her mother. Her mother was home at last. Helen held out her arms and felt herself being scooped up. But this wasn't her mother. These were strangers' arms. The stranger was Miss Annie Sullivan. She had come all the way from Perkins Institute to help Helen. All she knew was that a stranger was holding her, and Helen didn't like to be held by strangers. So she kicked, she twisted, she tried to break free, but the stranger's arms only tightened around her. Helen began to growl. Let her go, Miss Annie, Helen's father cried, or she will hurt you. Here's a picture of Annie and Helen, her mom and dad, and the suitcase. The arms loosened and Helen sprang free. Helen did not like strangers, but she was curious about them. Now she came back. She patted her hand across Annie Sullivan's face and down over her dusty traveling dress. Annie laughed. I can see that she doesn't like to be touched, but she isn't a yet frightened, is she?" Mr. Keller took his time answering. "No, Miss Annie," he finally said, "and I think that you will find sometimes that that's a problem." Early the next morning, Mrs. Keller led Helen into Annie Sullivan's room. It was time for the first lesson to begin. Helen didn't know this, of course, so she just wandered around the room, touching all the new things that the stranger had brought with her. One of the first things she found was Annie's suitcase lying open on the bed. Her curious hands plunged inside, and what was this? Helen's face lit up. She knew right away. It was a doll. She had others in her room. She wanted this one too. Helen snatched it out of the suitcase and hugged it close. "It's a present for Helen from the little blind girls at Perkins," Annie told Mrs. Keller, "and it's also as good as any place to get started." She picked up Helen's hand. Helen started to tug away, but then she stopped. What was the stranger doing in her hand? "This is called the finger alphabet," Annie explained to Helen's mother. "It's a way of talking to the deaf. I am making the shapes of D, O, L, L into Helen's palm. Then I will take her hand and run it over the real doll in her arms. You see, first the word and then the word, what the word stands for. The word and what it stands for again. I am simply trying to connect these two in her mind." "Look, Miss Annie," Mrs. Keller cried. "Helen is making those movements too." And she was. Slowly, Helen Keller's fingers was making the shapes of the word D, O, L, L. "What a quick little monkey you are," Annie murmured, and she bent down to her help. Then she saw the look on Mrs. Keller's face. "No, no, you must not get your hopes up so soon," Annie said quickly. Helen had learned how to make the shapes of her first words, and very fast too, but she does not know that these shapes stand for all the dolls in the world. She does not know that they have meaning. Now Annie turned back to Helen. "So come on, let's go on with the lesson." Annie pulled the doll out of Helen's arms. She meant to give it back as soon as Helen spelled the word D, O, L, L again. But Helen didn't know this. All she knew was that the stranger was taking her doll away from her, and she wanted it back. Again and again, Helen reached for the doll, but her hand only touched empty air. She wanted to growl. She began to growl. "Look out, Miss Annie," Mrs. Keller cried, but her warning came too late. Helen came charging. Her fist shot out, and she hit Annie Sullivan right in the mouth. Helen could not hear her pain-filled cry, but she could feel the stranger jerk away, and she smiled. "Oh, let her have the doll," Mrs. Keller cried. "It's the only way to calm her." "No," Annie said, "there is another way. Helen must learn self-control." "But Helen doesn't know what self-control is," Mrs. Keller answered. "She doesn't know how to keep her temper." "Then that is the first lesson I must teach her," Annie Sullivan said, "for I do not think I can teach her anything else until I do." Helen came charging again, but this time Annie was ready for her. She grabbed Helen's arm and hung on as tight as she could. Helen kicked and screamed for quite a while. Then suddenly she went limp. "So, my girl," Annie said, "have you had enough? Are you ready to go on?" Time to stop for today. More later.